And I just like reading Tolkien and talking to experts like we've got with us here today about these kinds of things. So it's a joy to be able to do this virtual thing and not miss out entirely on what DragonCon is like. Let me go first to Laura, and then we'll get to Constance. Laura.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Grabowski. I'm also known as Valdis Longbeard in my capacity as the executive director of Middle-earth News, which you can find at middleearthnews.com. I'm a real noob when it comes to DragonCon compared to Jim and Constance. I have been covering the con since I think 2014 on behalf of Middle-earth News, and have been delighted to be able to also join in some of the panels that talk about Tolkien and other related kinds of high fantasy interesting things.
Great. And Constance, here at DragonCon and on the high fantasy track, we have a special title for some of our panels, and it's called Whatever Constance Wants to Do. So that's what this panel is this year. Constance, tell us who you are.
Whatever Constance wants to do is to work with Jim and Laura on different topics, because I think that the three of us together make a good team and that we really dig into the topics really well, So, but hi up everyone here on DragonCon virtual land, and particularly hi to all our high fantasy friends. And for those of you where this is the first time you're joining a high fantasy track, I hope you have a good time. I hope you enjoy delving in just as we do. My background, as Jim had said, is that I am a Tolkien scholar, and I have several articles out working on a book. I'm also a writer of fiction and nonfiction, lots of scholarly articles about Tolkien and other things, and a published poet. And I run a writing program at St. Peter's University in Jersey City. So that's me. But what the most interesting thing is that we get to play with Tolkien. And today we are doing a character study on Éowyn and Faramir, whom are, basically, we're calling this the face of the fourth age. And as you will find out as we go through this panel, why we feel that way, and I'm sure you do too. So this is, let's just dive in, Jim, okay? So you can actually, just the header.
Yeah, we'll go in. So you're getting a twofer today.
Yes.
Two fan favorites, really. And so we're going to go in. I'm going to try to display something. I'll try to not put much of the display up on the screen because I bet you'll want to look at least Constance and Laura more than my PowerPoint. But we at least wanted to make a little bit of a connection as far as where the attraction is with Faramir and with Éowyn together. The Lord of the Rings is a quest fantasy, which means any good quest fantasy ends with the wedding. Now, the reality is both Tolkien and not quite Peter Jackson love, I guess, multiple endings. So we don't get just one wedding, we get three weddings at the end of the Lord of the Rings. Aragorn and Arwen, Sam and Rosie, and our spotlight today on Éowyn and Faramir. Constance, you want to say anything about these weddings?
Yeah, actually a little bit. And we have Aragorn and Arwen, which is a way to combine the bloodlines of elves and men. And then we have the hobbits, who are quintessentially more like humans than they are like elves, And then finally we have Éowyn and Faramir, who are decidedly human. And I think that's one of the things that makes them very relatable and why they're such fan favorites. And that's what we want to explore today, in that people really find some kind of resonance with these characters for a number of different reasons. And what we're going to do today is explore their similarities and differences as people and how they ended up together as a couple and their contribution to the continuing life of Middle-earth. So
the whole face of the fourth age theme that we've picked is we've got literally a human king of long Númenórean lineage and an elf maiden of fantastic beauty who's a descendant of Beren and Luthien, somewhere in the mix, and you get that kind of a wedding. That's pretty high and noble. And then you get this rustic hobbit wedding. But with Faramir and Éowyn, you get a true human bond.
A true human bond, yes. And I think that Jim froze a little on my screen. Okay.
Yeah,
Let's
me
hope
too. So
let's hope we're not losing him.
I
Let's just keep moving here and see what
we
happens.
will.
Okay. All right. So it's an interesting shot. So hopefully we're still transmitting. I hope, you know.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I think then, yeah, the teaser is that we're trying to explore that. So Laura, do you want to move on and start talking about Éowyn?
Okay, sure. Let's do that. So just to bring everybody up to speed, in case you are not remembering, or you're not as into all of this as we clearly are, just to give you a quick reminder of kind of Éowyn's biography, her background. She is the second child of Theoden's sister Theodwyn and her husband Éowyn, their first child, of course, being Éomer, Éowyn's brother. After Éowyn was killed and Theodwyn died of illness, Theoden took in, or excuse Theoden, Theodwyn, I'm not sure if I said the right name, sorry. Theoden took in Éowyn and raised her as his own child. So of course, Éowyn is really, when we meet her, she is the epitome of the shield maiden. You know, she is both maiden and warrior, and a real good description of that is, in fact, what Tolkien says about her through the eyes of Aragorn. It's the first real description that we get of Éowyn in the book. The first mention of her is simply as a woman clad in white behind Theoden's chair. But the first description of her is, as I said, through Aragorn's eyes. And so it goes like this. Grave and thoughtful was her glance as she looked on the king with cool pity in her eyes. Very fair was her face, and her long hair was like a river of gold. Slender and tall she was in her white robe girt with silver, but strong she seemed and as stern as steel, a daughter of kings. Thus Aragorn for the first time in the full light of day beheld Éowyn, Lady of Rohan, and thought her fair, fair and cold, like a morning of pale spring that has not yet come to womanhood. I see we have Jim back.
Yes, I waved at him. So that he's
Thanks
doing
for coming back.
Thanks for coming back. You know, so
The
you saw that ring, okay? Or you disappear, right?
when
So-
it goes out. Yeah.
All right. So I was just talking a little bit about Éowyn, and just talked about her in that shield maiden idea. Of course, she was also the caregiver to Theoden in his decline under the influence of Grima Wormtongue and, of course, Saruman. Also with Éowyn, we have an interesting theme in a couple directions of unrequited love. So there is first Éowyn's unrequited love for Aragorn. Aragorn really was her first love, or maybe it was more like a crush. Okay, and so here Aragorn for Éowyn there was this hero worship going on, but also, of course, he was a potential means of escape from what she perceived as her cage, her very limiting kind of existence in her eyes, being relegated to care for her aging uncle, and eventually to not be allowed to go off to battle. Then the other interesting thread here is is Éowyn as the object of unrequited love. Here, of course, she is loved by Grima Wormtongue, and I don't know, this look on her face to me is just kind of looking at him like the embodiment of what in her eyes is her completely unglorious future as she sees it. Another thread about Éowyn that I think is important in terms of her biography is that Éowyn is a leader, and she is recognized as a leader by her people. She's looked up to by her people. And of course, she is given that role when the army leaves to go to Gondor. Even though she abandoned that charge and rode off disguised as Sternhelm, she still had that place of honor among her people, and certainly had the leadership chops, if you will, to be able to pull that off. Okay, so that's just a little précis about Éowyn's background and biography. So take it away, Constance.
Okay, so
Or if we want to backtrack, Jim, into the what we had before.
I was curious if you wanted to do that quote, Laura.
yes, actually you did a little bit
Oh,
about it, but
excuse
you
me,
can show
I'm
us.
sorry. I missed one. My bad. Absolutely, absolutely. We need to see the quote. So, so this is very much where we see Éowyn at that almost that point of inflection of her getting ready to throw away that charge of leading the people, to rule the people in Theoden's stead.
There you go.
There we go.
Okay.
We go on to Faramir.
Oh. So you're now finding the quote? Okay, so should I just moving forward?
Yeah, go ahead.
Not going to show. Okay, we can go on later on and show it again. So I love that illustration. We have that quote about her being
Did the quote not come
caged. It did not come up.
Sorry.
There we go.
That's Faramir. Hi, Faramir. Okay. Gonna roll past. There it is. Yay. Okay.
There we are. So here it is. This is, of course, quite well-known quote. Shall I always be left behind when the riders depart, to mind the house while they win renown, and find food and beds when they return? I am of the house of Éowyn, not a serving woman. I can ride and wield blade, and I do not fear either pain or death. What do you fear, lady? He asked, he being Aragorn. A cage, to stay behind bars until use and old age accept them, and all chance of doing great deeds is beyond recall or desire. Now we can move on to
Now we can.
Well, now that we've set up, basically the match game here, we're going to talk about Faramir as his own self for a moment, and then we'll move on to the other things. So we can see Faramir, if you like. We saw him briefly there for a second. Okay, here we are. Here's Faramir. Oh, coming up. Here we are, Faramir. Hi, Faramir. All right, now, Faramir is a character that we see in many lights, and we will break these down accordingly as we move along. And also talk about his specific relationship to Tolkien further into the conversation. But the first thing that we see Faramir is as part of a family. So if we can, yes, so here we see as the stewards of Gondor, and there's Denethor, his father, who is the steward of Gondor. And Boromir was supposed to take that place after Denethor died, and that eventually that Faramir himself becomes a steward. But they are related, they are descended from one of the more famous and spectacular stewards of Gondor, who took over when the last king of Gondor went off to war. Okay, and that is, they're descended from, I want to say this correctly, they're descended from Mardul, I believe. Let me just get the background here. Yeah, okay, from Mardul, who was under King Éomer's, under his province. So that's a long time to hold on to a job, and that's why at one point when Boromir wonders how long do you have to, serve in order to what would be considered royal, and Denethor, to his credit, says, in lesser countries perhaps sooner, but not here. That royalty remains, and we are guarding the throne for the king. We are working with it. And Denethor begins to think differently about power later on, but that's another panel. Okay, so we have Faramir as the son of this house. He's the second son, and we'll talk about the relationship a little bit more, but first he's a brother, and that's how we learn about him initially. So we have a relationship with Boromir, and they have, as is shown in the movie, it's a very interesting relationship. It is very brotherly. Faramir's the second son, he's the little brother. Boromir, is the older brother who has control of the situation. Sometimes Tolkien referred to Boromir as a kind of a bossy older brother. and because he takes control of each situation. Faramir knows his own gifts and he's content with his position, but he really does love his brother. It's very evident when you see him in scenes with Frodo initially in the book, when there's that kind of interrogation, and he's concerned about finding information about what exactly happened to his brother. And he's hoping that they would bring some information. And it's not necessarily from a military standpoint. He really wants to know what happened to his cherished sibling. And the conversation, the way it's written, you do get a sense of it. And there's a little bit of sense of that in the movie too. But we know that things are dropped and put in different positions. But he definitely is somebody who admires his older brother and understands what pressures Boromir is under as well. He does understand his brother's character very, very clearly and completely. So we have him, lo and behold, as a brother, and then we can see him as a son. And then I think that's our next slide here. Okay, yeah. So just go back one, Jim, to that other picture with Denethor and
Faramir. Pupil first. Then.
Yeah. So, this is the wizard's pupil. I'm sorry. All right, let's talk about that then, since it's right there. Okay, there we are. I'm sorry. I was looking at an aging Denethor in my mind because I do have something to say about that. But this is the wizard's pupil slide. So that is part of Faramir's claim to fame, and it does sort of rankle Denethor that Faramir was more interested in lore and learning and wasn't more like his military-oriented older brother. But it doesn't mean that he didn't love him. So that really is a consideration, in that he does love Faramir because when he comes back from fighting, he says, you should go and get some rest. And then he sends him off. He goes, well, I do wish that your other brother had gone there, but it still doesn't mean that he despises Faramir. There's nothing like that in there at all when you do a close reading of the character. So there is love, but he knows he's trying hard to please his father. So the relationship, I guess, is mixed at that point. And the fact that Denethor wants to take Faramir with him into the afterlife is kind of a twisted love, but then he's been twisted by his association with the Palantir and whatnot. So that is not to see that there was no love in that family. But going back to the idea of him being a wizard's pupil, Faramir does have some abilities in that direction. He has prophetic dreams. He is steeped in lore. He understands more of what's going on a theoretical or a philosophical basis than perhaps his older brother does, because that's not his focus. So that is kind of where that sits. So our final thing then about Faramir for this little nutshell presentation and of this little section here is about Faramir as warrior. I think we have some slides about that. So, okay. I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. And that is a wonderful, wonderful quote, because it does encapsulate his feeling about warfare to a great degree, and that he knows that he has to defend his city, the realm, his land, and he's willing to do what he can to do that. But it also shows that he understands the uses of warfare, but he's not in love with warfare for itself. Which may be a little bit different than his brother, who was like for the glory of Gondor, and it's through military prowess to a degree. But Faramir it's more of a Renaissance kind of thinking, I think. He wants a more balanced perspective in that way. So we do have, you see a real deep sense of chivalry in Faramir, and that he's very knightly and courteous. A lot of that comes out in his conversations with a variety of people, including Frodo, and then conversations he has with Éowyn also, where he talks about his place in society. So I think that's kind of a nutshell take on him. We'll move this forward. I could talk for a long time on this, but we want to cover a lot of areas, so we'll move on.
We're not going to let you, but I am going to back up. Now that you've had the introduction to both Éowyn and Faramir, I want to talk a little bit. I got cut off before, and so if I get cut off again, it will be a sign that I'm not supposed to talk about
this. No, we always want you with us. Okay.
Just be ready. I will try to do this one more time here.
Okay.
Because now that you've seen a little bit of their story, you can kind of get a feel for how, if they had known one another earlier, they probably would have swiped right, is how we're saying it. And so you see both are warriors, different types of warriors, different values as warriors. And that's part of their coming together and part of both of their ennoblement, really. You see that they're both second siblings. And in many ways, they are both overshadowed by that older sibling. particularly in their battle prowess. They both have kingly fathers. In one case, it's an adopted father for Éowyn and a direct father, and neither one of them has mothers, which is a pretty interesting convention that you see a lot in Tolkien. They both suffer deadly wounds, and we'll learn about that later, and then come together in the houses of healing as they're recovered. And one of those wounds is very fiery, that is Faramir's, with the poisonous dart. And one of them is very icy with the black breath of the Nazgul. And so that is kind of part of a bonding experience for them. And then they both have great hobbit affection. That is that they have both acquired almost a hobbit squire along the way, in terms of Pippin being one of the guardians of the tower or the citadel, and then Merry becoming a page or a squire for Theoden himself. And so that'll come up as well. So a lot of crossovers between these characters. So let's keep going past all this introductory stuff. And did you talk?
No, I did not talk about the Great Wave. That was part of what the connection is about him being a wizard's pupil. This really is something that's very cogent to the point, in that the Great Wave, for those of you who are not familiar with it, was a recurring dream that Tolkien had since childhood. And he had it regularly. When he wrote about the downfall of Numenor, it finally didn't repeat to him. And so he gifted the dream to Faramir in The Lord of the Rings to describe what was happening with the inundation of the land, and that it was always a precursor of disaster, but it was dreaming about some ancient legend. And Faramir does bring that up, which we can talk about more fully later. But he does have this dream where you're looking at an ancient way, and then he has dreams about his brother's death. So being a wizard's pupil, it's not to say that he has magical powers, not really, but he has dreams that he's sensitive to what they might mean. And I think that's really a fascinating point. And as a little side note, when Tolkien was talking about the Great Wave dream that he had, he found out later on in life that one of his children actually was having the same dream, even though he had never spoken about it with them. So that's kind of an interesting side note in his personal history.
Right.
So yes.
It was interesting for me that recognizing that Faramir inherited Tolkien's own Great Wave dream. Mm-hmm. That, as Peter Jackson did in the movies, he tended to shift lines around with folks, and this great dream wave he gave to Éowyn.
Yes.
In the extended edition.
Yes, in the extended edition, and she tells it to Aragorn in the extended edition. But Faramir does describe it and tells it to Éowyn later on.
Yeah, it speaks to the resonance of their character. We had one comment over here on YouTube that it's interesting that they're two sides of the same coin, where Éowyn pursues warfare for glory and Faramir does it for protection. They're seemingly opposites, but highly connected. So why don't we dive into those kinds of themes and some of the bonding and the binding ideas that bring Éowyn and Faramir together. I think you're going to kick us off, Laura. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So Jim just ran through that great summary of how these characters are really quite similar in many aspects. And with our little character introductions, Constance and I have also touched on particular areas where they're different. And some of the comments on YouTube are also bringing those differences up. So what were the experiences that finally started bringing these two together? So of course there's this big idea of brushes with death, right? So they both had these brushes with death, and we have the entire episode in the Houses of Healing, which of course in the book is given some amount of detail. We have a whole lot less detail we have none whatsoever in the theatrical cut of Return of the King. And we get at least a little snippy in the extended version, right? So first of all, we did have that element that Jim already brought up, which was the influence of the black breath and also the blood poison that from the dart that was the wound that Faramir received. And the thing about the Black Breath, and they were both under the influence of the Black Breath as well. And of course, Éowyn's arm was broken when the Witch King shattered her shield. And the thing about the Black Breath is that it's not just about the physical injury. And of course, both of them received severe physical injuries as well. But the Black Breath has this sense of despair and just doom that settles on a person. So that then when they're both healed by the healing hand of Aragorn, the king returned, it's both the physical healing, and I'll get back to that in a minute, and also this beginning of the lifting of that despair that was the influence of the Black Breath. And of course, for Éowyn, that Black Breath just compounded the despair she was already feeling following her rejection by Aragorn. So this just all kind of piled on Éowyn. And of course, Faramir also had recently had the loss of his brother and his father's descent into madness. So there was an awful lot going on for both of these characters in their family connections. And so here we are now with Éowyn and Faramir in the Houses of Healing. And eventually, of course, the army rides off to go to the Black Gate for the big distraction, right? So to try to win Frodo some time to get the ring to Mount Doom. And so here we are in Gondor in the Houses of Healing, and they are waiting. That's all they can do at this point. They are just waiting. So something that we were talking about as we were preparing our panel is this idea of both the frustration and the blessings of waiting. Because of course, for Éowyn and Faramir, without that waiting period in the Houses of Healing, this relationship may never have actually taken root and eventually blossomed. So on the blessing side of this, there is this big feeling of being separated from the world. So they really are out of the world when they're in the Houses of Healing, and almost suspended in time. But then the flip side of that is they don't have any news about what's actually happening off eastward. Kind of the only thing they can infer is that, well, Sauron hasn't won yet, because we would know if he had, but they don't know the status of anything else. And what really came to mind when we were discussing this as panelists is that there are some really clear tie-ins to Tolkien's ideas about fantasy and what makes fantasy important, and the kind of functions that fantasy serves. So there is his well-known essay on fairy stories. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It is a very interesting read. It's not terribly long, and it gives incredible insight into really Tolkien's own thoughts about the big framework within which fantasy stories works. So there's a lot of detail that we could talk about, but we won't because we don't have time. But we'll hit on three key themes that Tolkien says and talks about in fairy stories as being central to fantasy stories, fantasy literature in particular. So, and these are the ideas of escape, recovery, and consolation. So in this sense, escape is not necessarily escapism. Okay, that's kind of its simplest, most surface level kind of escape. But he's really talking about the escape of the prisoner. So escape being freed from something. And ultimately, of course, the biggest escape is from death. And certainly both of these characters had literal escapes from death. Éowyn survives this confrontation with the Witch King, which is, nothing short of miraculous. And Faramir then is healed from this deadly, deadly wound. And then also Faramir becomes an agent, in particular of Éowyn's escape, because he helps Éowyn to escape finally from her despair. So we have these kinds of ideas here. Recovery can mean physical recovery, and we've already talked about how that is certainly the case for both of these characters, but also Tolkien means recovery with the idea of recovering a clear view of yourself and yourself in the world. So seeing things anew, seeing things afresh. So in recovery, we're looking at the idea of stepping back and getting out of your old ways of thinking. So re-examining your fundamental assumptions. And of course, Éowyn absolutely does this. In particular, it's very noticeable with her when she finally does turn to Faramir as a partner. Okay, and there's a lovely quote for that. It's a short one. Then the heart of Éowyn changed, or at least she understood it, or at last she understood it. And suddenly her winter passed and the sun shone on her. I stand in Minas Anor, the tower of the sun, she said, and behold, the shadow has departed. I will be a shield maiden no longer, nor vie with the great riders, nor take joy only in the songs of slaying. I will be a healer and love all things that grow and are not barren. And again, she looked at Faramir. No longer do I desire to be a queen. So there's this clarity of vision and understanding of who you are and where you are in the world. And then we have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let me ask you about that, Laura, because that seems like a pretty big arc for Éowyn. You're talking about cages and being escape. And we saw that quote that says, what do you fear? I fear a cage. And she wants to escape into battle. The quote you just read us was that thawing idea that Éowyn is expressing. So I'll ask you both as women, is that a believable arc for you? That idea of, I don't want to be placed into a cage under constraint, under other people's rules and regulations and assigned roles. And therefore she takes up her arms as Durnhelm. And then she has this consolation, which is in a really different direction. So I was curious how you both received that idea.
I actually have a point, and then we can go back and forth with that. I'm listening to that quote, and I made notes and for the other section, but it really does, with that quote that Laura just read, that I will be a healer and love all things that grow and are not barren. I will be a shield maiden no more. At that point, she comes, to know that society is changing and that she is able to. How did I put it here for my own notes? That she's come to her healing and maturity when the shadows pass, and there's needs for gifts other than those of war. But she already has them because she has been a caregiver, and she does govern her city when it's given to her to do so. So she does have these abilities. And speaking as a woman, yeah, we do what's needed. And I think that's a believable arc. Of course, we're not all running off to war, and building cities. Some of us are, not all of us, but the idea that you can be assertive and aggressive when need be, and then say, okay, well, that's done. Now we need to do the things where we're fixing things. Okay, so I found it very believable. So Laura, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I do find it believable. So one of the things that certainly, again, we talked about a lot as we were thinking about what we wanted to talk about today in this panel. Very often you hear the idea from readers of Tolkien that Éowyn kind of, I don't know, she sold out, or why does she have to stop being, this strong warrior woman type and just, be Faramir's little wife, right? But really the way that we looked at that or some of the things that we talked about was that, first of all, this is not a lesser thing.
Right.
It is a very different kind of role. And she does say that she won't delight only in songs of slaying. So it doesn't feel like she's not leaving her entire culture behind her.
Songs of slaying along.
Occasionally, I'll watch them on TV, and
Yeah, we'll add some new stuff to the playlist. So yeah, it's but definitely I just wanted, again, to point out that thing that this is not a diminishment of her. It really is her opening her view and moving on into another phase of her life and another kind of role. But yeah, it's and certainly it's one of these things too that I believe for Éowyn, this is a believable arc because of the presence and influence of Faramir. That this is part and parcel of these two characters coming together.
Right. That may be a good segue over to Constance, because you were going to talk about those characters coming together in the way of destiny and of choices. In some ways, it's surprising again. At least I remember thinking when Faramir and Éowyn fell in love in the Houses of Healing. Well, there's a twist a little bit, because you kind of expected that there would be a lingering relationship with Aragorn, and all of a sudden she lets that go. And then they both get new callings. So Constance, why don't you pick it up there? I'll try to.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and it's good that you mentioned Aragorn, because Aragorn does inform the structure of the rest of their lives, because he is the king, all right? He will be the king. And Faramir has recognized him as such, okay, or will do so. And they understand that they each have their positions in life, but Aragorn, having a high destiny, he was never going to be with Éowyn, although she perhaps thought maybe, but not, okay? No matter what Tolkien originally had planned, once he created the idea of Arwen as being the appropriate partner for him, then Éowyn as shield maiden, not the best match. As we said at the beginning, that they should be, that Faramir and Éowyn are better together. So Aragorn's destiny as king allows them to both have opportunities, okay, to become their true selves, wherein Éowyn can find out that she's more than the person who takes care of the household, who wants to be a soldier. And then she finds out she's more than a soldier, right? She's actually a combination of many things. And Tolkien himself, when talking about Éowyn, said, let me find a quote here. He says that in one of his letters, he said, Éowyn was not really a soldier or an Amazon, but like many brave women, was capable of great military gallantry in a crisis. So because Éowyn was so isolated, perhaps she only saw that role with that longing. And then finally, when she's confronted with it, yes, she does prove her valor, but she also begins to realize she does have other gifts, and that's what the association with Faramir brings her. So she has a choice of a different kind of destiny. And that Faramir, once the king returns, he's the steward and his role is over, even though Aragorn does say to him, no, you keep your office. And as steward, Faramir announces Aragorn as king returned to the city, and he also becomes one of his chief counselors, because the war isn't over yet, as we know. Okay, the big bad is gone. We still have to mop things up for a while. So he still is one of his chief advisors. He's given, land to be prince of. And so Éowyn begins to have a more royal position than she was even expecting, because what she was expecting to do was die in battle, and now suddenly she has another life to live. So the two of them together begin to find more human ways of being with each other, things that are important, but maybe not so epic now that the big bad of Sauron is gone. Now it's society building, which is epic enough, but at least it doesn't have the fantastical attached to it anymore. So I think that's one way to look at it. Faramir gets to choose his own path. He's asked, basically, you can retain this office. You can be my advisor. He accepts, for my king. So he agrees to do that. And then he asks Éowyn, if I could love you, could you love me? And initially, I think there's actually a sort of a funny aside when they're in the Houses of Healing, when Éowyn is just despairing. And essentially, he's thinking, I can't do anything for you except get you a better room. But right now you're in the houses of healing, and at least you have an affect to look out, and you look over to the west, and you can have some connection to what's going on outside, and maybe that will help you. So he becomes a caregiver to her in an interesting way. So what else did I want to say about that? So
We had a question
oh, sure.
from the YouTube feed. I think that feeds into here. The question was, how does Éowyn and Faramir's love story compare to Aragorn's and Arwen's? And particularly, for example, in this story of calling or change of calling, the book is called The Return of the King. So
Yes.
not a lot of ambiguity about Aragorn's calling, no matter how ambiguous it gets filmed in various representations, but Aragorn's going to be the king.
Right.
Tolkien was actually a little worried about the title, that he might be telegraphing too much with it. And Arwen, there's appendices that talk about their love story.
Right.
But so in this story, clearly there's one of those is a difference between how these threads come together. But just generally in this union idea, what do you see as some of the major either similarities or differences in those love stories?
All right, so, and then I'm sure that Laura will have something to contribute as well with this. With Arwen and Aragorn, as I mentioned briefly before, that is the uniting of elves, and then the bloodlines are joined again. But that Aragorn has some elvish blood too from way back when, but largely he's human. He is human, but the lines are joined together, and that's a way to infuse that into the human population more so, into the royal line anyway. So that's a similarity in that two things are joined, and that there's an intention of making things fresher and more in line with what perhaps Luvatar's plan may have been from the beginning. Okay, with Éowyn and Faramir, it's decidedly human, but they both bring very beautiful things to the union and strengthen the bond of both their communities. And they've been through much together. They understand what it's like to have to strive for your place in society. So they have compassion for people who are, the underdog. For example, we have Éowyn and Merry, and then obviously Faramir, is friendly with Pippin and sees the value of hobbits in that way. He's impressed with Frodo for a different reason, because he sees Frodo as a separate calling, but his deepest association with hobbits is with Pippin. So he learns more about what the simple folk need in life, okay, as opposed to royalty and soldiers. So the two of them bonding together like that have seen life on a number of different levels. And I think that their marriage becomes very solidly the union that's needed to be for the fourth age to continue, which the focus, it's the age of men. So we need to look at decidedly human values, and that's striving and understanding that everybody's multifaceted. That you can be somebody who has military valor when needed, but then once that's over, you go home, and now they beat the swords into plowshares. That's what's going on here. Even though they're not exactly going to farm their own fields, they are a decidedly human couple. So
Awesome.
Laura's nodding. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So what I was thinking about with that question, a couple different things, but we think about how long the courtship of Aragorn and Arwen was. I mean, this lasted for decades.
Yes.
It started out, of course, Aragorn was quite young. I think he had just turned 21 or something like that when he first met Arwen, and we know he's whatever, how old he is, old in simple count of years, when he finally is crowned king.
88, I think 88.
Something like that.
Yeah,
anyway, so yeah, this was a very, very long courtship, and even though they committed to each other, some years before, and of course Faramir and Éowyn was kind of a classic whirlwind romance, and of course Tolkien responded to criticism of this whole thing moving so fast. It's like, well, it was a wartime romance. Yes. Right. And in times of war, these things do tend to move a little more quickly. So kind of just the pace of the romance itself was on very different time scales. And the other thing though that I'm thinking with Éowyn and Faramir is that kind of going back to the fairy stories ideas that I was talking about a few minutes ago, because for them, this romance, and their eventual marriage, it really was that completely unlooked for surprise happy ending for the
Okay.
two of them, which is, one aspect of that idea of consolation that Tolkien talked about. So it's so there is, there they are.
So there they are. It also yes, it also occurs to me.
Wedding photo.
Oh, here's the one the dress that Holly ever sees, those outfits that the costume designer said she wished they had kept in the movie because she loved working on those outfits, as I recall. But what's interesting about that, when you said about the two marriages, et cetera, we have Aragorn and Arwen. We talked about what the import of that is, but that is like they fell in love, meeting like swans. This is basically what it is. It's Beren and Luthien, and it's Tolkien and his wife also, one match and one match forever. And then we have Éowyn and Faramir, who basically do mirror wartime romances where things are intense and you meet, but you know you're no mind enough to know that this is what you want and this is what you need. And Éowyn herself does a lot of growing, through her experiences. And she, at that line is so beautiful. At last, she understood her own heart, basically, because the sun comes out for her. And she suddenly is aware, well, okay, I don't have to be an adolescent badass. That's part of who I am, but I'm not an adolescent anymore. I'm somebody with many layers to my personality. I'm not just a shield maiden. I'm not just a housekeeper. I'm not just a daughter or a niece or whatever. I am my fully formed person. And here's someone who sees me in that way. But more importantly, I finally see myself that way. And that's what he gives to her. And what she gives to him, I think, basically, is that she sees him as, not as a second son, and not as somebody who's not as good as Boromir or whatever, how father may have occasionally slipped into that, or not as heroic as Boromir. She sees him as somebody who saw her for what she was and accepts her, and is a strong person in his own right. So
we're into the deeper union theme. We get we'll come back to hobbits here in a second, but I passed on to you. There's this wonderful passage in the Two Towers in the chapter Windows on the West.
Yes.
And Faramir is describing to Frodo, he's just giving him some backstory about not only him, but his father and Gondor, and he's reaching all the way back into Numenor. And he has this fascinating commentary where I don't think he's being arrogant about this, and I certainly don't think he's being racist about it, but he kind of divides humanity up into three hierarchies, if you will. And so for him, the noblest pinnacle are the Numenorians, not because they're powerful, but because of their wisdom, because of their beauty, because of their longevity, because they have connections in their lineage back into not only elves, but to the Maiar, almost angelic. And so that's kind of pinnacle. And then he calls them middle men. And so the peoples of Rohan or the peoples of Lake Town, the ones that, have regular normal lifestyles. And then he talks about wild men, like the ones that are assembling with Sauron to attack Gondor. But his main reflection is a couplefold. One is that he feels like increasingly the Gondorians have become middle men, as is his critique. It's that we've lost something. And as much as he loves his brother and his father, he attributes that kind of, we have come to, we ennoble the warrior more than we will the skilled artisan or craftsman. So somehow that has become for us more important and more honored. And for Faramir, he describes it as a lessening, as an erosion or a decay of nobility, in much the same way as that road to the crossroads is awfully straight, but it's just covered with debris. And so he's feeling kind of covered with debris. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, well, he's critiquing his brother Boromir about he only really cares about arms. But in a way, he's kind of critiquing Éowyn before he even meets her. And he's saying, our whole peoples have become kind of like that. So this union is becoming an ennoblement of both of them, a path towards, ultimately, we're talking this at the end, this face of the fourth age that is more hopeful towards the restoration of what's been lost.
Right.
It's, the ability to build things again that were lost like they used to, in a way. And so Aragorn's at the pinnacle of that, but Faramir and Éowyn are right at the heart of that story, right where we live in that story.
Right. And that's really crucial to think about it. I keep thinking like they bring out the best in each other because they bring different things to the party. They bring different gifts to the table, but they're going to make their union is stronger because they both have been through difficulties and they understand that you can be at a low level and then rise above that and still come out a stronger person where you haven't really lost something. I don't know that people argue, well, Éowyn gave up, being a warrior. So, she knows what's appropriate for the time. That's growth, and if something happens again, I could see her that she would also, be able to do that again, to rise to the occasion. She doesn't have to go out looking, for people to, kick butt. That's not the point. That is actually very adolescent when you think about it. Just going to do that all the time because that's what I was trained for. She was trained for many things, and now she's accepting the whole package of her education and also of who she actually is and what she wants to do. It's her choice. That agency is very important. She chooses that once she understands herself better. So does Faramir. He said, "I'm not a king, so you're not marrying a king." And then all of a sudden, he has other ennoblement given to him by Aragorn, inviting him to be one of his chief counselors. You'll be in charge when I'm gone. And, you're the Prince of Athelia. Here you are. So virtue is its own reward.
Yeah. So and just to quickly touch on really something or what Jim already said. So I guess mostly to just reinforce that, and come back around yet again to our subtitle for the panel. The face of the fourth age. So they are that, as we've already said a couple times, with the fourth age being the age of men.
Yes.
So they are very clearly the representative in that category. And also together with Rosie and Sam in the Shire, and
Yes.
even Aragorn and Arwen, they are symbolic of the renewal of life. And as Jim said, that rebuilding of the world coming out from the shadow of Sauron after his destruction.
So here's one for you, Laura. It comes from James Lawler. Éowyn leaving Rohan, leaving her charge behind so she can go off to war. Good things happen, between she and Mary. They kind of took down the Witch King. But was that a good thing? Was that a failure of responsibility or of stewardship to go off to the fight? How does that reflect in her arc that ultimately,
Right.
results in this marriage?
Or of course, the other way we could ask it is, what was it? Was it a flaw or was it fate? Yeah. As the questioner put it. So, I hadn't really thought about that very much until we started preparing this panel, and it's like, oh my goodness, she just totally blew off taking care of Rohan and just up and left. Yeah. So
ever wonder?
From one perspective, it's kind of horrifying. But you also understand it. So fate, maybe, there certainly are lots of threads of fate that run through Lord of the Rings. And certainly she and Mary together needed to be there to take out the Witch King. Yeah. So maybe it was fated and she had to do that. The way she came to that decision, it certainly feels like it was completely selfish. She was completely self-centered, it seems, in her decision to do that. All she
Okay.
was thinking about, as best we know, is what she wanted to do.
Want to-
So perhaps both is the best answer. It sounds kind of like, hedging my bets, but I think maybe it really was both.
Yeah, I would agree with that it was both. With Laura and I had this conversation where we said, oh my God, who's in charge after she leaves? That there's nothing said. So, and talking about it right this minute, what occurs to me is that I think she would be responsible enough to say, okay, Joe, you're in charge, before she left, and Joe's in charge, or Joe might be. So she goes off to do this, although she wasn't revealing that she was going off to war. But I like to think somehow there was it wasn't just chaos when she left. She had to go fulfill her calling as a warrior because she was very crucial to the outcome. You still have choices, and so she chose to lead, but I don't think she would completely blow off her responsibilities, even though she was leaving in secret. I'd like to think there's some way to do that. Because if she did, then the story would have been quite different. Okay, yes.
Hopefully she at least left a note.
Yeah, I'd like to know. Cancel my milk. I'm leaving. I'm going to work.
We got like 3 or 4 minutes left.
Oh God. Okay.
Here's the 1-minute drill. Why did these two accumulate hobbits?
Why did they accumulate hobbits? Okay. All right, Laura, I'll let you start because I'll sit there and ponder Pippin and Frodo
But
and
you only
whatnot.
get like 30 seconds for this one because
Right, yeah, I can do this quick. Well, so of course, we already know and heard about Éowyn and that cage quote. So here's Mary, who Éowyn sees as a reflection. Maybe she's projecting, but she sees this same prisoner, this same cage, this same feeling of an outsider reflected in Mary, and she is not going to stand by and allow him to be left behind. So by golly, she takes him with her.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So Faramir has a relationship with Pippin that is so deeply bonded because there's more involved in it. Where Pippin ends up naming one of his children after Faramir, and he comes back to years later to live in the same area with Aragorn and be involved in that life again. I think that perhaps Faramir sees in the hobbits a hope for the future. These are even the smallest person can change the future, that quote that floats around, that he does see that. And I think he sees real value in their a great place, the Shire, where people who of simple taste and values are held in such honor. And I think he sees that in order for the Gondorian Renaissance, they need to be aware of that too. So I think that that's a bonding relationship for that reason.
So in the last minute that we have, I want to go to the seminal scene and see if you have any final thoughts, because this is the scene where it all comes together. It all comes together. Faramir and Éowyn come together. The destruction of the ring comes together. The consolation and the turn, the happy ending, all of a sudden happens. And this is the scene. You can look at it. I think it is in the Houses of Healing chapter. And so I'm going to ask you to comment on it quickly. We're going to go over a couple minutes, gang. So who wants to read Faramir?
I'll read Faramir. Okay, we can go screen by screen. So I'll start. We'll just trade off, the three of us. Okay.
No. Constance, you'll be Faramir. Laura, you're going to be Éowyn. And I'll be. Okay, so you lead, Constance. You're first.
Okay. We wait for the stroke of doom, said Faramir.
And they said no more.
And they said no more.
I got it from here. I'll be the narrator. So
okay.
They said no more. And it seemed to them as they stood upon the wall that the wind died and the light failed and the sun was bleared and all sounds in the city or in the lands about were hushed. Neither wind nor voice nor bird call nor rustle of leaf nor their own breath could be heard. The very beating of their hearts was stilled. Time halted. You know what? There aren't a lot of quotes. Laura, take it from here.
And as they stood so, their hands met and clasped, though they did not know it. And still they waited, for they knew not what. Then presently it seemed to them that above the ridges of the distant mountains, another vast mountain of darkness rose, towering up like a wave that should engulf the world. And about it lightnings flickered, and then a tremor ran through the earth, and they felt the walls of the city quiver. A sound like a sigh went up from all the lands about them, and their hearts beat suddenly again.
Constance.
It reminds me of Numenor, said Faramir, and wondered to hear himself speak. Of Numenor, said Éowyn. Yes, said Faramir, of the land of Westerness that foundered, and of the great dark wave climbing over the green lands and above the hills, and coming on darkness inescapable. I often dream of it. Then you think that darkness is coming, said Éowyn. Darkness unescapable, and suddenly she drew close to him.
Back to Laura.
No, said Faramir, looking into her face. It was but a picture in the mind. I do not know what is happening. The reason of my waking mind tells me that great evil has befallen and we stand at the end of days. But my heart says nay, and all my limbs are light, and a hope and joy are come to me that no reason can deny. Éowyn, Éowyn, White Lady of Rohan, in this hour I do not believe that any darkness will endure. And he stooped and kissed her brow.
And as they stood on the walls of the city of Gondor, and a great wind rose and blew, and their hair, raven and gold, streamed out, mingling in the air. And the shadow departed, and the sun was unveiled, and light leaped forth, and the waters of the Anduin shone like silver. And in all the houses of the city, men sang for the joy that welled up in their hearts, from what source they could not tell.
And so we get their hair mingling picture. What a catastrophic, I guess, moment here.
Catastrophic moment. Well, okay, yeah, that.
Yeah.
Really, that's very beautiful, because you do see in that scene really the face of the fourth age is that this epic battle somehow is coming to a conclusion, and now they're facing the future together. You know, they had their part in it, but now they're actually feeling it wash over, like as all the regular people who weren't involved in the quest up to this point, that they can experience what it's like to be on the fringes, but also to be in the waiting, you know, and the realization that. And you begin to understand yourself better in the waiting sometimes, because when you're intensely involved in something, all you're thinking about is your next action. Here they can be contemplative, and they can accept the moment and then plan for the future. So.
Laura, any final thoughts from you?
Just how wonderful that segment of the story is, and how beautiful the writing is, and of course the echo of the idea of the great wave, but now it's the great wave of the joy and the relief of Sauron's influence over the world having been lifted.
Yeah. So that wave imagery, I think, is great. It comes right back. The other thing that strikes me about this, and you can see it in that picture, I'll put it up again one last time, it is this image is happening at the same instance that the ring itself is dissolving, is dissoluting. You have an integration, a coming together, a literal blending of hair. The way that Tolkien describes it, the raven and the gold, this union that is captured at that same moment, which I think is very intentional, and it's given to Faramir and Éowyn. We don't even have the weddings that are coming, but it's that moment when she thaws, his heart changes, they come to one another, and I think it's a great story of hope.
And it really is a moment of peace when you talk about, you know, Tolkien putting his attitudes into Faramir, that Tolkien really did not appreciate war, you know, and all the speeches about whether this person was really evil at heart that Sam says and gives to Faramir in the movie. But Faramir does have those attitudes about he really would rather have peace than war, as we know from the Blade quote. That actually is a culmination that they're combined together now to look forward to the future. It really is peace that everybody's heart sings, because there's hope, there's peace. This part is over, and now we can go forward.
So we will have given now Constance the final word, because this is the whatever Constance wants panel. Thank you, Constance. Thank you, Laura. Thanks for all of you who have watched or who are going to watch the video. This will be available on the High Fantasy YouTube channel. So we're glad that you joined us, and go out and be like Faramir and Éowyn.
Right.
I think we're off. I hope we're off.
It still says live. Are we still live? Or are we Memorex, you know? It says live, Jim.